The floorboards were cold, but not as cold as my brother's eyes. My ribs were already broken. He'd seen to that an hour ago when I dropped a plate. Just a simple mistake, but in our cabin, there was no such thing as a simple mistake. There were only mistakes that earned you a slap, and mistakes that earned you a whole lot worse. This was one of the worst ones. I lay where I'd fallen, cheek pressed to the rough wood, tasting dust and a little of my own blood. Each breath was a razor blade in my side, a sharp, grinding reminder of what I was. I was a dropped plate. I was a nuisance. I was something to be fixed with a fist or a boot. My ribs are already broken, I whispered to the dust bunnies dancing in the single shaft of afternoon light. The words didn't make a sound. They were just a puff of air, a thought that died before it could reach the walls of my prison. Outside, I heard his boots on the porch, that heavy, familiar tread. Once, a long time ago, when I was small and Ma was still alive, that sound meant safety. It meant Pa was home from the fields and Jeremiah was back from hunting, and the three of them were my whole world, a wall against the hardness of the frontier. But Ma died. Then Pa died. And the wall Jeremiah built around me wasn't to keep the world out. It was to keep me in. The boots stopped. I held my breath. Sometimes the rage would pass like a summer storm. He'd come back inside, his face all confused and sorry, and hand me a cup of water. He wouldn't say anything, but he'd sit there while I stitched myself up, his silence a different kind of punishment. But not today. The silence on the porch stretched on, getting tighter and tighter, like a rope being wound around my chest. He was out there, working himself up, staring at the unforgiving land that had taken everything from him, everything but me. And he was deciding what to do about that. What to do about the last thing in the world he had any power over. The door didn't just open. It scraped and groaned, like it was in as much pain as I was. I didn't look up. I learned that lesson years ago. Looking at him when the whiskey fever was on him was like staring into the sun. It just burned you faster. Better to be small. Better to be still. Better to be a rock in the river and let the current rage around you. Look at me. His voice was quiet. That was the worst. The shouting was just noise, a storm that passed. The quiet was a cold, deep place where he made decisions. Awful decisions. I didn't move. The pain was pulling me down, into a gray, fuzzy place where nothing felt quite real. Maybe if I just floated here long enough, I'd float away completely. I said, "Look at me, Clara." His boots came into view. Scuffed leather, stained dark with things I didn't want to think about. Then his hands hanging at his sides. The knuckles were raw and bloody. He'd been hitting the woodpile again before he'd come for me. Slowly, I lifted my head. I made myself meet his eyes. They were our mother's eyes, pale blue and once so kind. But the years, the drink, the bitterness, they'd worn them down to something flat and empty, like chips of ice. "You think you're too good for this place?" he said, his voice a low rumble. "Too good for me?" I wanted to tell him no. I wanted to say I'd never thought that. I scrubbed the floors, I mended his clothes, I cooked the little we had. I never asked for anything. I just wanted peace. But the words were stuck in my throat, tangled up with the fear. He started circling me, slow, like a wolf sizing up a wounded deer. "Pa always said you had too much of Ma in you. Said it would make you soft. Said it would make you weak." He stopped behind me. I could feel the heat coming off him, the stale scent of whiskey and rage. Guess he was right. The mention of our parents sent a new kind of pain through my chest, one that had nothing to do with my ribs. Pa was a hard man, but he was fair. Ma was gentle as a songbird. Neither of them would recognize this monster wearing their son's face. "Get up," I tried. I pressed my hands against the floor, trying to push myself up. But the pain in my side exploded, a universe of white-hot stars, and I fell back with a gasp that was half a sob. I said, "Get up." His boot caught me in the shoulder. Not hard, just enough to send me sliding across the floor until my back slammed against the log wall. I stayed there, curled up, and felt something inside me finally give way. Not a bone this time. Something deeper. The tiny, stupid part of me that had kept hoping things would get better. That part of me died on the cabin floor, and in its place, a strange, cold emptiness settled in. It almost felt like relief. "Can't even do that right," Jeremiah sneered, his voice dripping with disgust. He sounded like he was talking about a lame horse that needed to be put down. "Can't do nothing right." And I realized he was right. I couldn't make him happy. I couldn't stop the pain. I couldn't even get up off the floor. The shaft of light from the window had moved across the room. The afternoon was bleeding into evening. Soon he would drink himself into a stupor, and I would have a few hours of quiet before we started this whole ugly dance all over again in the morning. But as I lay there against the wall, a new thought whispered through the emptiness inside me. It wasn't a word. It was a feeling, a flicker of an idea that maybe, just maybe, there was an away, a somewhere else, a place beyond these walls, beyond this endless, repeating pain. The thought was so dangerous I almost choked on it. Hope was a poison in this place. It only made the hurt worse when it was ripped away. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to banish it. But it was there, a tiny seed, planted in poisoned soil. Jeremiah finally turned and stomped into his room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed in the sudden quiet. "My ribs are already broken," I whispered again. But this time the words felt different. They weren't a surrender. They were a statement of fact. A person could be broken and still be breathing. A person could be bent to the snapping point and still have something left inside that nobody could touch. Outside, a whippoorwill called its lonely song into the vast empty darkness. I listened to it until my body gave up, and I fell asleep right there, curled against the wall. A dangerous new promise whispering in my heart. Dawn was a bitter gray smear against the window when I woke. My whole body was a symphony of pain, each breath a fresh agony. But underneath the hurt, something new had hardened overnight. A resolve, fragile as ice, but just as sharp. From the back room, Jeremiah's snores rattled the thin walls. They were thick, whiskey-soaked sounds. He always slept like the dead after the bad nights, as if the violence wore him out too. This was it. This was my chance. I eased myself away from the wall, biting my lip to keep from crying out. Every movement was fire. I moved across the floor on bare feet, stepping only on the boards I knew wouldn't creak. I'd memorized this path on countless nights, sneaking to the water bucket or tending the fire while he slept. The door was the only thing between me and a world I hadn't seen in years. I'd stared at it 1,000 times, but never like this. Never as an exit. My hand closed around the cold iron latch. For a second, I froze. His snoring hitched. My heart hammered against my broken ribs. If he woke now, if he found me here. But the snoring started again, deep and steady. With the care of someone disarming a bomb, I lifted the latch. The morning air hit my face like a bucket of cold water. It was so sharp, so clean. I'd forgotten what air was supposed to smell like. For a moment, the sheer size of the sky made me dizzy. It stretched on forever, with no ceiling to hold it down. I grabbed the door frame to keep from falling. The porch boards were rough beneath my bare feet. I took one step, then another. At the edge of the porch, I stopped. I looked back at the cabin. It looked smaller from out here, meaner, like a festering wound on the land. Then I turned my back on it, and I didn't look back again. The dirt road stretched out before me, pale and dusty in the growing light. I'd only ever walked it as far as the creek for water. I'd never been beyond the bend, where it disappeared into the pines. Each step was a new torture. The sun climbed higher, beating down on my torn dress. My bare feet, soft from years inside, started to crack and bleed on the sharp stones. But I kept moving. Fear was a good motivator. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a bird sent a jolt of terror through me. I imagined him waking up, finding me gone. I imagined him coming after me, tracking me like a wounded animal. I knew he would. He couldn't stand to lose the last thing he owned. By late afternoon, I was done. I collapsed beside the road, my back against a sun-warmed boulder. My throat was lined with dust. I had nothing left. The world around me was a blur of heat and pain. Maybe this was it, I thought. Maybe this was how it ended, dying free on the side of a lonely road. It was better than dying in that cabin. At least out here, the sky was big. At least out here, His hands couldn't reach me. That's when I heard it. Hoofbeats. At first, I thought it was my own heart, trying to beat its way out of my chest. But the sound grew louder, clearer. A single horse coming up the road behind me. Fast, it was him. It had to be him. I tried to run, to hide, but my body wouldn't obey. I dragged myself a few feet off the road, into the pathetic shade of a stunted pine tree, and collapsed. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to will myself invisible. Just another shadow on the rocks. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped. "Easy there, Ranger," a man's voice said, low and steady, not Jeremiah's voice. My heart was a hummingbird in a cage. I heard him dismount. I heard his boots on the hard-packed dirt, coming closer. "Miss?" The word was gentle, careful, but I'd learned not to trust gentle words from men. They could turn into knives in a heartbeat. "Miss, are you hurt?" He was closer now. I could smell leather and horse sweat and something clean, like soap. "I'm not going to hurt you?" That's what they all said. But something in his voice, a weary kindness I hadn't heard in so long, made me open my eyes. He was crouched a few feet away. A big man, broad-shouldered, his face weathered by the sun. He was holding himself carefully, the way you approach a frightened animal you don't want to spook. His eyes were dark and full of a concern that looked real. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said. I tried to tell him I was fine. I tried to tell him to go away before Jeremiah found us both. But my throat was too dry. All that came out was a broken whisper. "My ribs are already broken." The man's face changed. Something shifted in those dark eyes, like clouds moving over deep water. He didn't move closer. He just settled back on his heels, giving me space. "I can see that," he said, and his voice held no pity, just a simple, calm acceptance of fact. "How long you been walking?" "Since dawn," I managed. It felt like a lifetime. He nodded slowly, his eyes taking in my torn dress, my bleeding feet, the way I was trying to hold myself together. "My name's Thomas," he said. "Thomas Garrett. You don't have to tell me yours if you don't want to." The kindness of that, the simple gift of a choice, almost broke me. "Clara," I whispered. The name felt strange, like I was meeting myself for the first time. "Clara," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "That's a good, strong name." I almost laughed. There was nothing strong about me. I was a pile of broken pieces. He must have seen the thought on my face. "You're hurt bad," he said. "More than just the ribs." It wasn't a question. "Someone did this to you. Someone you were supposed to trust." The truth of it hit me so hard I couldn't breathe. I just nodded. A muscle jumped in his jaw, but his voice stayed level. "Are they coming after you?" I tried to warn him, to tell him about Jeremiah's temper, but all I could manage was a choked sob that meant yes. He nodded, as if he understood everything. "Then we best get you somewhere safe." He stood up, slow and easy, his hands where I could see them. "I've got a place, a cabin not too far from here. It's hidden. You'd be safe. Are you willing to trust me that far?" Trust? The word was a foreign language. The only person I'd ever trusted had taught me that love and pain were the same thing. But what choice did I have? Die here on the road, or take a chance on this man with the sad, kind eyes? "I can't," I started. I couldn't walk. I couldn't even stand. "I know," he said. And somehow he did. He saw it all. "That's all right. My horse is steady, and so are my hands. I won't hurt you any more than you already are." He led me to his horse, a big sorrel with intelligent eyes. He lifted me as if I weighed nothing, his touch surprisingly gentle. The pain in my side flared, but I bit back the scream. He settled me in the saddle and swung up behind me, his arms a careful protective barrier around me. "Lean back if you need to," he said. "Won't think less of you for it." And for the first time in years, I did. I let myself lean against the solid warmth of a stranger and close my eyes as he guided the horse off the road and into the trees, away from the life I was leaving behind, and towards something I couldn't yet imagine. The path he took was no path at all, just a winding trail through the pines that only he could see. After a while he spoke, his voice a low rumble at my back. "Almost there." I opened my eyes. Tucked into a hidden clearing was a small log cabin. Smoke curled from its stone chimney. It looked peaceful, safe, a word I didn't believe in anymore. "It's not much," Thomas said as he helped me down, "but it's solid, and no one will find you here." He led me to the open door, where warm, yellow light spilled out into the twilight. I looked at that light, and I felt something I thought had died on the cabin floor. A tiny, fragile flicker of hope. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I took a step towards something, instead of away. "My ribs are already broken," I whispered to the quiet cabin. But this time, the words weren't an ending. They were an admission, a recognition that something broken could, maybe, be mended. And that's when I saw it, hanging on a peg just inside the door. A man's hat, dusty from the road. But underneath it, almost hidden, was a woman's sunbonnet, faded but carefully preserved. My blood ran cold. He had said, "I've got a place," not "we." Who was she? And where was she now? I woke to the smell of wood smoke and coffee. For a moment I didn't know where I was. I was lying in a real bed, under a thick wool blanket. Sunlight streamed through a clean window. My body still ached, but the sharp edges of the pain had been smoothed away. I was in Thomas Garrett's cabin, the cabin with the mysterious sunbonnet. I lay still, pretending to be asleep, and listened. I heard the crackle of a fire, the soft clink of a spoon against a cup. He was moving around the room with a quiet confidence. "You're awake." His voice came from near the fireplace. He didn't turn around, just stated it as a fact. "How long?" My voice was a dry rasp. "2 days," he said. "You had a fever. It broke last night." 2 days, my mind was a complete blank. I remembered stepping through the door and then nothing. Just flashes of cool water on my lips, a gentle hand on my forehead. A low voice reading from a book when the nightmares got bad. His voice. He walked over to the bed, holding a steaming mug. He moved slow, careful not to startle me. "Brought you some broth," he said, setting it on a small table beside the bed. "Figured you might be hungry." My stomach growled in response. I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten a real meal. He helped me sit up, propping pillows behind my back. His touch was gentle, impersonal. He handed me the mug, and our fingers brushed. I flinched, and he pulled his hand back immediately, a flicker of something, regret, apology, in his eyes. The broth was hot and rich. It felt like life itself flowing back into me. I drank it slowly, watching him over the rim of the mug. The cabin was one big room, neat and organized. Shelves filled with books lined one wall. More books than I'd ever seen in one place. This was not the home of a simple trapper, and there on the peg by the door was the sunbonnet. It seemed to mock me from across the room. "Why?" The words slipped out before I could stop it. He looked up from where he was tending the fire. "Why what? Why are you helping me? You don't know me. You don't know what kind of trouble I could bring to your door." My eyes flicked to the bonnet. "You live here alone?" He followed my gaze. A shadow passed over his face, a deep, old sadness. "Yes," he said quietly, "I live here alone. Now." He settled into a chair across the room, giving me space. "I had a sister once. Her name was Sarah." His voice was low and steady, but I could hear the pain threaded through it. "She married a man who seemed like a good fellow, charming, said all the right things. But after the wedding, things changed. She'd visit with bruises she couldn't quite explain. She started making excuses for him. She grew quieter, smaller. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. I knew this story. "We all saw it," he continued, his eyes fixed on the fire. "But we didn't know what to do. Every time we tried to step in, she'd push us away. Said we didn't understand. Said she loved him." He paused, his jaw tight. "One day she just stopped visiting. When I finally rode out to their homestead to check on her, I found her in the barn. He said she'd fallen from the hayloft. A tragic accident." "But it wasn't an accident," I whispered. "No," Thomas said, his voice flat and hard as stone. "It wasn't. The sheriff called it a tragedy and closed the case. The husband was a pillar of the community, you see, and Sarah, well, she'd become difficult, he told everyone. Moody, prone to fits. He finally looked at me, and in his eyes I saw a grief so profound, it stole my breath. So when I find a woman on the side of the road with broken ribs and fear in her eyes, I don't ask questions. I just help, because I didn't help my sister. I stood by and let it happen, and I'll carry that to my grave. The story was so full of pain, so honest, that it should have reassured me. It explained everything. The kindness, the cabin, the solitude. But it didn't explain the sunbonnet. Sarah had died. So who did the bonnet belong to? And then, as I looked at him, truly looked at him, I noticed something else. A small white scar, barely visible on his left wrist. It was an old scar, but the shape was unmistakable. It looked like a brand. A simple block letter J. My blood turned to ice. Jesse for Jeremiah. Was it possible? Was it just a coincidence? In this vast, empty territory, what were the chances? My mind raced. What if Thomas wasn't just a grieving brother? What if he was something else entirely? What if Jeremiah's rage wasn't just about drink and bitterness? What if he was running from something, or someone? What if this kind man who saved me hadn't saved me by accident at all? My brother's name is Jeremiah, I said, my voice carefully neutral. I watched his face for any reaction, any flicker of recognition. He just nodded slowly. Jeremiah, he repeated. He's the one who did this to you. There was nothing in his eyes, no recognition, no surprise. He was either the best liar I'd ever met, or I was losing my mind, seeing ghosts where there were none. He stood up and brought the pot of broth over, refilling my mug. Get some more rest, Clara. You're safe here. I promise. I leaned back against the pillows, the warm mug in my hands, and watched him move around the cabin. He seemed so good, so kind. But the J on his wrist burned in my mind. The sunbonnet on the wall whispered secrets I couldn't understand. My ribs were already broken. That was a simple physical truth. But as I sat in that quiet cabin, cared for by a man whose story didn't quite add up, I realized a terrifying new truth. Maybe my ribs were the least broken thing about my situation. Maybe I hadn't escaped a prison at all. Maybe I had just walked into a different, more complicated cage. The days that followed were a strange mix of peace and paranoia. On the surface, everything was calm. Thomas was the perfect caretaker. He cooked for me, changed the bandages on my feet, and read to me from his collection of books. He had a deep, soothing voice, and for hours at a time, I could almost forget my fears. I could almost believe I was safe. My body was healing. The bruises were fading from purple to a sick yellow-green. I could breathe now, without feeling like I was being stabbed. I was getting stronger, but my mind was a whirlwind of suspicion. I watched Thomas constantly. I studied his every move, listened to his every word, searching for a crack in his story. I saw the J on his wrist every time he handed me a plate or tended the fire. It was a constant, silent accusation. He never mentioned his sister again. He never asked about my life with Jeremiah. It was an unspoken agreement. We lived in the present. The past was a locked room we both pretended didn't exist. One afternoon, while Thomas was out checking his snares, I finally gave in to the gnawing curiosity. My legs were still weak, but I managed to get out of bed. I limped across the cabin to the peg by the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the sunbonnet. The fabric was worn, softened by years of sun and washings. It was a simple, practical thing. Nothing special about it. I looked inside, searching for a name, a clue, anything. There was nothing. Frustrated, I turned my attention to the rest of the cabin. Where would a man hide his secrets? My eyes fell on a small, locked chest at the foot of his bed. It was old, bound with iron straps. My heart pounded. This was wrong. I was violating his trust, the trust of a man who had shown me nothing but kindness. But I had to know. The lock was simple. I found a piece of wire from the fireplace tools and, with fumbling fingers, managed to jimmy it open. The lid creaked as I lifted it. The chest was filled with papers, old letters tied in bundles with faded ribbon. A deed to the land, a few tin-type photographs. One was of a young woman with Thomas's dark eyes and a gentle smile. Sarah. She was beautiful. Another was of a stern-looking man and woman, their parents, I guessed. Then I found a bundle of letters tucked in the corner, separate from the others. The handwriting was different, a messy masculine scrawl. My hands shook as I untied the ribbon. The first letter began, "My dearest Margaret." Margaret, not Sarah. My breath caught in my throat. I read on, my eyes flying across the page. The letters were from Thomas. They were love letters written years ago, full of hope and plans for the future. He wrote about building a life together out west, about starting a school, about children they would have. He wrote to her from a place called Philadelphia. He'd been a teacher. The last letter was dated 5 years ago. It was short, the ink smudged in places, as if by tears. Margaret, my love. The fever took her. Our Sarah is gone. Her husband, that devil Cale, claims it was an accident, but I know better. I saw the bruises he tried to hide. I will not let this stand. I am selling my share of the school and coming west. I will find justice for our sister. I will not rest until Cale pays for what he did. Cale, not Jeremiah. And the letter was to his wife, Margaret. I sank to the floor, the letters clutched in my hand. My carefully constructed tower of suspicion crumbled into dust. The J wasn't for Jeremiah. The bonnet wasn't Sarah's. It must have belonged to Margaret, his wife. A wife he had never mentioned. A wife who was, I assumed, back east. Waiting for him? Or was she gone, too? The story he'd told me was true, but it was incomplete. He hadn't just lost a sister. He'd lost a wife, too, or at least left her behind. He wasn't just a grieving brother. He was a man on a mission of vengeance. And I was just a complication he'd found along the way. Just then, I heard the sound of footsteps outside. Thomas was back. Panic seized me. I shoved the letters back into the chest, my hands clumsy and shaking. I couldn't get the lock to catch. I just slammed the lid shut and scrambled back to the bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin. I was breathing hard, my heart hammering against my mending ribs. The door opened. Thomas came in, a pair of rabbits slung over his shoulder. He stopped when he saw me, his eyes narrowing. He looked from my flushed face to the chest at the foot of his bed. The lid was slightly askew. He knew. The silence in the cabin was deafening. He didn't say a word. He just walked over to the chest, knelt down, and straightened the lid. Then he stood up and turned to face me. His expression wasn't angry. It was something worse. It was disappointed. "You were looking for answers," he said, his voice quiet. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, shame washing over me in a hot wave. He pulled a chair up to the side of the bed and sat down. He looked so tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than I'd ever seen them. "My wife's name was Margaret," he said, his voice heavy with a grief that was years old but still raw. "She died of fever the second winter we were here. That was her sunbonnet. I keep it there to remember her." He held up his left wrist, showing me the scar. This wasn't a brand. Caleb, my brother-in-law, Sarah's husband. His full name was Caleb Jones. He was a blacksmith. This happened during a fight years ago back east. A hot piece of iron. It was an accident. One of the few things he did that truly was. Caleb Jones, J for Jones. It all made a terrible, tragic sense. I had been so wrong. I had painted this good, broken man as a villain, all because of my own fear. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "Thomas, I am so sorry." "You have no reason to be sorry, Clara," he said, his voice gentle. "You've been taught that the world is a dangerous place, that kindness is a mask. You survived. You did what you had to do." He looked at me, and his eyes were full of a deep, aching understanding. "But now you have a choice. You can keep living in that prison of fear, or you can choose to trust. Starting now." He held out his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. It was a bridge across the chasm of my fear and suspicion. My ribs were already broken. That much was true, but they were healing. Scars would remain, but the bones would knit back together, stronger than before. What about my trust, my spirit? Could they heal too? Could I let go of the girl who flinched at every shadow and take the hand of the man who had pulled me out of the darkness? Slowly, hesitantly, I reached out and put my hand in his. His grip was warm and strong. It felt like an anchor. But as our hands touched, I noticed something I had never seen before. Tucked under the sleeve of his shirt, just above the J scar, was another mark. Fainter, older, but still visible in the afternoon light. It was a tattoo. A coiled snake, with a single chilling word tattooed underneath it. Morrison. And my world shattered all over again. Ben Morrison, the owner of the general store in the nearest town. The man Thomas had said was asking questions about me. The man Thomas said seemed interested in the money Jeremiah was offering. What if Thomas hadn't been warning me about Ben Morrison? What if he was working with him? My hand recoiled from his as if I'd been burned. Thomas's expression shifted from gentle understanding to confusion. Clara? What is it? Morrison, I whispered, my voice trembling. Your tattoo. He glanced down at his arm, his eyes widening slightly as he realized what I'd seen. He quickly pulled his sleeve down, but it was too late. The image of that coiled snake was seared into my brain. It's nothing, he said, his voice suddenly guarded. It's from a long time ago. Ben Morrison at the general store, I pressed, my heart hammering. You told me he was asking questions about me. You said he was interested in Jeremiah's money. He was, Thomas said, his gaze unwavering. That's the truth. But what is he to you? I demanded, my voice rising. Are you partners? Did he send you to find me? Is this whole thing, this rescue, this kindness, is it all a lie? He stood up and walked to the window, his back to me. For a long moment he just stared out at the trees. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken secrets. I felt like I was suffocating. It's not a lie, Clara, he said finally, his voice low and strained. Everything I've told you about Sarah, about Margaret, it's all true, but it's not the whole truth. He turned back to face me, and the look in his eyes was one of a man who had been carrying a heavy burden for a very long time. My brother-in-law, Caleb Jones, he didn't just kill my sister, he said, his voice hard. He was part of something bigger, a land-grabbing scheme run by a group of ruthless men. They'd force homesteaders out, forge deeds, and sell the land to the railroad. Caleb was their muscle, their enforcer. He paused, letting the words sink in. The man who ran the whole operation, the man who gave the orders, his name was Silas Morrison. Ben Morrison's father? I breathed. Thomas nodded grimly. After Sarah's death, I came west for justice. I wasn't just after Caleb. I was after all of them. I took a job at one of their logging camps to get close, to learn their ways. That tattoo, it was something they all had, a mark of loyalty. I got it to fit in, to get them to trust me. My mind was spinning, a teacher, a soldier, and now a spy. This man was a chameleon, a ghost. What happened? I asked. I gathered enough evidence to bring them down, he said, a flicker of grim satisfaction in his eyes. Exposed the whole scheme to a federal marshal. Most of them went to prison. Silas Morrison died in a shootout resisting arrest. Caleb disappeared, vanished before I could get to him. He ran a hand through his hair, the weariness of it all settling over him like a shroud. I thought it was over. I bought this land, built this cabin, tried to build a quiet life. I tried to leave that man, the man with the tattoo, behind. But, I prompted, my voice barely a whisper. But a few months ago, I heard whispers that Caleb was back in the territory, that he was working with Ben Morrison, trying to restart his father's old business, and that they had a new partner. A cold, sickening dread washed over me. I knew what he was going to say before he said it. A man who had inherited a piece of land they needed to complete a big sale to the railroad, Thomas continued, his eyes locking onto mine. A man deep in debt, desperate enough to do anything. A man named Jeremiah. The room tilted. Jeremiah wasn't just an abusive drunk. He was a criminal. He wasn't just trying to keep me under his thumb. He was trying to sell our land, our home, the only thing our parents had left us, and I was in his way. So when I heard a man matching Jeremiah's description was, in town, looking for his sister. Thomas said, "It wasn't an accident that I was riding on that road, Clara. I was looking for him. I was looking for a way to finally finish what I started all those years ago. Finding you, that was the accident." It all clicked into place. The pieces of the puzzle I had been trying to solve were all there. They just formed a picture 1,000 times more terrifying than I could have imagined. This wasn't just a family matter. This was a war. What do they want? I asked. The land. Why is it so important? There's a natural spring on your property, he explained. The only clean water source for 20 miles. The railroad needs it to build a new depot. Without it, their expansion plans are dead. Your land is the key to the whole thing. He hesitated. And there's something else. Your father, he was a smart man. He must have known Jeremiah couldn't be trusted. The deed to your land, it requires 2 signatures to sell, his and yours. I was speechless. All those years, all that abuse. It wasn't just about control. It was about my name on a piece of paper. I wasn't just his sister. I was a business asset he couldn't get rid of. Suddenly, a terrifying thought struck me. Thomas, the sunbonnet, Margaret's sunbonnet. What about it? He asked. It looks just like the one our mother used to wear. Thomas frowned, confused. It was a common style back then, Clara. No, I insisted, a new horrifying suspicion taking root. The stitching on the brim. Ma had a unique way of mending things, a little cross stitch pattern. I'd know it anywhere. I scrambled out of bed and rushed to the door, snatching the bonnet from the peg. My fingers traced the familiar pattern on the brim. It was there, faded but unmistakable. This wasn't Margaret's sunbonnet. This was my mother's. I turned to face Thomas, the bonnet clutched in my hand. My voice was a strangled whisper. Where did you get this? He stared at the bonnet, then at me, a look of dawning horror on his face. I found it, on the road. The day I found you, it was lying in the dust a few yards away. I assumed it was yours. It wasn't mine. I hadn't worn a bonnet in years. Jeremiah had torn my last one to shreds. But I knew who it belonged to. Before he died, Pa had packed away all of Ma's things in an old trunk in the barn. The bonnet was a message, a threat. Jeremiah hadn't just come to town looking for me. He had gone back to the cabin. He had been through our mother's things. He had left the bonnet on the road for me to find, a symbol of everything he was willing to desecrate to get what he wanted. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. If Thomas found the bonnet on the road before he found me, it meant Jeremiah had been there. It meant he had watched me collapse. It meant he had let Thomas find me. He had followed us. He knew where we were. He had known this entire time. This quiet, peaceful cabin wasn't a refuge. It was a trap. And we had been living in it for weeks. The illusion of safety shattered into a million pieces. The quiet cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. Every rustle of leaves outside, every creak of the floorboards, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. He was out there, watching, waiting. He's been playing with us, I said, my voice shaking. This whole time. He wanted you to find me. He wanted you to fix me up. Why? Thomas's face was a grim mask. He moved to the window, his hand resting on the rifle propped against the wall. He's not just working with Morrison and Caleb anymore, Clara. He's learned from them. This is how they operate. They don't just use brute force. They use fear. They isolate their victims. They turn them against each other. He wanted me to suspect you, I realized. He wanted me to be so afraid that I'd be easy to control when he finally came for me. And he wanted me to get attached, Thomas added, his voice low and dangerous. He wanted me to have something to lose. It's not just about the land anymore. It's personal, for both of us. We spent the rest of the day in a state of high alert, preparing for a war we now knew was inevitable. Thomas was no longer the gentle caretaker. He was the soldier he'd once been, focused and deadly efficient. He showed me how to load and fire his spare pistol, his hands guiding mine with a firm, steadying touch. Don't think, he said, his voice quiet but intense. Just aim for the center of whatever's coming through that door and squeeze. Don't stop squeezing until it falls. As dusk fell, painting the sky in bloody shades of orange and red, the waiting began. We sat in the darkening cabin, the silence broken only by the sound of our own breathing. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The friendly woods now felt like a cage closing in around us. Maybe he's not coming tonight, I whispered hours later, my voice hoarse from the tension. He'll come, Thomas said with absolute certainty. He's waited this long. He'll choose his moment. And then we heard it. Not hoofbeats, something quieter. The soft snap of a twig to the north, then another to the west. They were surrounding us. Thomas blew out the single lamp, plunging the cabin into near total darkness. He moved to the front window and I took the back, my pistol clutched in my sweaty hands. My heart was a wild thing, trying to beat its way out of my chest. The old fear was there, a cold knot in my stomach. But this time, it was mixed with something else, a hot, burning rage. Clara! Jeremiah's voice boomed out of the darkness, making me jump. It was the voice from my nightmares, full of false confidence and menace. I know you're in there, and I know you've got company. Send her out, Garrett, and I might let you live. Thomas didn't answer. He just stood like a statue, his rifle pointed toward the sound of Jeremiah's voice. She's family, Jeremiah shouted, his voice moving as he circled the cabin. This is a family matter. It's got nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me. Thomas called back, his voice ringing out, cold and clear. You're partners with Caleb Jones. You're trying to steal land. This ends tonight. There was a moment of stunned silence from outside. Jeremiah hadn't expected that. He didn't know that his enemy knew everything. Then his laughter echoed through the trees. It was a high, unhinged sound. You think you're so smart. You think you figured it all out. You don't know anything, you broken-down old soldier. You walked right into my trap. Suddenly, a bright light flared outside the back window. My window. I looked out and saw a torch, held by a large, bearded man I didn't recognize. He was standing next to the woodpile. He wasn't just holding the torch. He was about to set our home on fire. It's Caleb, Thomas breathed from across the room. Before I could react, the front of the cabin erupted in gunfire. Glass shattered. Bullets ripped through the walls, sending splinters of wood flying through the air. They were trying to pin us down, to keep Thomas busy at the front, while Caleb set the fire at the back. I dropped to the floor, my ears ringing. I could hear Thomas's rifle crack in response, a steady, methodical rhythm. One shot, a scream from outside, another shot, a curse, then silence. But I was frozen, paralyzed by the chaos, the noise, the sheer violence of it all. I was that girl on the floor again, small and helpless. Clara! Thomas yelled. The fire! You have to stop him! I knew he was right, but I couldn't move. My fingers were numb around the pistol. Then, through the splintered back window, I saw Caleb laugh as he touched the torch to the kindling stacked against the cabin wall. Flames erupted, licking hungrily at the dry logs. And in that flash of firelight, I saw something else. Standing just behind Caleb, half hidden in the shadows, was another man. Ben Morrison from the general store. And he wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a rope. Jeremiah hadn't just come to get my signature. He hadn't just come to kill Thomas. He had come to make me watch my new life burn to the ground and then drag me back to the old one. He wasn't going to kill me. He was going to break me, completely and utterly, until all that was left was a signature on a page. The sight of that rope, of Ben Morrison's smug face, broke the spell of fear. The rage that had been simmering inside me exploded. He was not going to win. I would not let him. My ribs are already broken, I whispered, the words of prayer, a war cry. You can't hurt me anymore. I rose from the floor, my movements fluid and sure. I raised the pistol, just as Thomas had taught me. I didn't think. I centered the sight on Caleb Jones's chest, and I squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in my hand, the sound deafening in the small cabin. Outside, Caleb staggered back, a look of pure shock on his face. He dropped the torch and clawed at his chest, then collapsed into the growing fire. Ben Morrison stared for a second, his mouth agape, then dropped the rope and scrambled back into the darkness. The shooting from the front of the cabin stopped. The silence was sudden and complete, broken only by the crackle of the flames outside. Clara! Thomas's voice was tense. He's down, I said, my own voice sounding strange and distant to my ears. Caleb is down. It's not over. a voice snarled from the front porch. Jeremiah. Before Thomas could react, the cabin door burst open. Jeremiah stood there, a wild, desperate look in his eyes. His face was streaked with dirt. His clothes were torn. He wasn't the confident monster from my memories. He was just a cornered, pathetic man, and he was pointing a pistol straight at Thomas. You, he spat, his voice trembling with fury. You took everything from me. She was never yours to take, Thomas said, his rifle still pointed out the window. He hadn't turned around. It was a standoff. If he turned to face Jeremiah, Jeremiah would shoot him. If Jeremiah shot him, the men outside would rush the cabin. But they weren't the only ones in the room. I was still standing by the back window, my pistol in my hand. Jeremiah hadn't seen me. He was so focused on Thomas, on the man he saw as the source of all his problems, that he hadn't even looked for me. To him, I was still just the prize, the object, not a threat. That was his final fatal mistake. I took a deep breath. All the years of pain, of fear, of swallowed words and silent screams narrowed down to this single moment. I was not the girl on the floor anymore. I was a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side. Slowly, silently, I raised my pistol. It's over, Jeremiah, I said. His head whipped around. The shock on his face was almost comical. He stared at me, at the gun in my hand, as if he couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. The little sister he had beaten and terrorized was standing there, ready to kill him. Clara, he whispered, his voice cracking, put that down. We're family. No, I said, my voice as cold and hard as the barrel of the gun. You stopped being my family the first time you raised your hand to me. For a split second, I saw a flicker of the boy he used to be, a flicker of fear and regret. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the familiar sneer. You don't have the guts, he taunted. That's when Thomas moved. In one fluid motion, he spun around, bringing the butt of his rifle up in a brutal arc that caught Jeremiah square in the jaw. Jeremiah's gun went off, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the ceiling, and he crumpled to the floor unconscious. Silence. The fire outside was spreading, casting dancing, demonic shadows on the walls. We have to go, Thomas said, grabbing my arm. Now! We scrambled out the back, into the smoke-filled night. The back wall of the cabin was an inferno. We ran, hand in hand, not looking back, as the home that had been my sanctuary and my prison burned to the ground behind us. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the woods, where we collapsed, coughing and gasping for air. We watched as the flames devoured the little cabin, consuming the books, the memories, the last ghosts of my past. It was all gone. Is it over? I asked, my voice raw. Thomas put his arm around me, pulling me close. Yes, Clara, he said. It's over. But as the roof of the cabin finally collapsed in a shower of sparks, I knew he was wrong. Jeremiah was still alive. Ben Morrison had escaped, and we were standing in the middle of the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on our backs and a single smoking pistol. It wasn't over. It had just begun. And I had a sickening feeling that the fire, the shootout, Jeremiah's rage, it was all just a distraction from what they were really after, the deed. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone exactly where it was. Not in the cabin. Thomas had hidden it somewhere safe, somewhere they could never find it, or so he thought. We spent the night huddled in the woods, the dying glow of our home, a grim beacon in the darkness. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the acrid smell of smoke that clung to our clothes and hair. We didn't talk. There were no words for the ruin we had witnessed. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees, Thomas stood up. His face was set in hard lines, his eyes dark with a resolve that frightened me. Stay here, he said. Don't move. Don't make a sound. Where are you going? I asked, my voice a croak. To end this, he said. The deed is in a lockbox buried under the floorboards of the woodshed. They didn't burn that. I'm going to get it, and I'm going to take it to the marshal in Cedar Falls. With my testimony and yours, we can put them all away for good. My blood ran cold. The woodshed, of course. It was the one place they wouldn't think to look. But Jeremiah knew this land as well as I did. He knew every hiding place. "Thomas, no," I pleaded, grabbing his arm. "It's a trap. He knows you'll go for it. He's waiting for you." "I have to, Clara," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's the only way." He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the soot from my cheeks. "You're the bravest person I have ever met. You survived him. You fought back. Now let me finish it." He kissed my forehead, a brief, desperate press of his lips, and then he was gone, melting into the morning mist like a ghost. I was alone. The silence of the forest pressed in on me. Every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep. Every shadow looked like a man with a gun. I clutched the pistol, its weight a small, cold comfort in my hands. Thomas had told me to stay put, but I couldn't. I couldn't be the girl who waited to be rescued. Not anymore. I began to circle around the clearing, moving through the trees like a phantom, my bare feet silent on the pine needles. I had to see. I had to know. I crept to the edge of the woods, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my still sore ribs. I could see the clearing, the smoldering ruins of the cabin, the intact woodshed standing like a lonely tombstone. And I saw him. Thomas. He was moving low and fast across the open ground, his rifle held at the ready. He reached the woodshed door, paused for a second, then slipped inside. My breath hitched. It was too easy, too quiet. Then I saw the movement. On the other side of the clearing, near the creek, two figures detaching themselves from the shadows of the trees. It was Ben Morrison and Jeremiah. My brother was alive, his head bandaged, his arm in a crude sling, but he was on his feet, and he was smiling, a triumphant, evil smile. They weren't waiting for Thomas in the woodshed. They were waiting for him to come out. They crept toward the woodshed, guns raised. They were going to catch him in the open, trapped between the hiding place and the woods. My mind screamed, I had to do something. I had to warn him. I raised my pistol, but the distance was too great. I was no sharpshooter. I would miss. I would only give away my position. Then I saw it, a few yards from where I was hiding, a pile of dry brush and leaves, left over from when Thomas had cleared the land. And next to it, dropped in Caleb's haste, was the torch he had used to start the fire. It was out now, but the end was still black and oily. An idea, desperate and insane, sparked in my mind. Jeremiah had used fire to try to destroy me. Now I would use it to save us. My hands shook as I worked. I used the last of my strength to tear a strip of cloth from the hem of my dress. I found a piece of flint in the dirt. I wrapped the cloth around the end of the torch, praying it would catch. The first strike of the flint failed. The second. My panic rose. Inside the woodshed, I could hear the sound of floorboards being pried up. Thomas had the box. He was about to come out. Come on, come on! On the third try, a spark caught. A tiny ember glowed on the oily rag. I blew on it, gently at first, then harder. A small flame flickered to life. I plunged the torch into the pile of dry leaves. It went up with a whoosh, a column of thick, acrid smoke billowing into the morning sky. Across the clearing, Jeremiah and Morrison spun around, startled by the sudden fire. They looked toward the smoke, confused, searching for the source. It was the opening Thomas needed. The woodshed door flew open. Thomas burst out, not with a lockbox, but with his rifle blazing. He wasn't surprised. He had known it was a trap, too. He'd gone in anyway to draw them out. Morrison went down first, clutching his leg and screaming. Jeremiah, his good arm useless, fumbled with his gun, trying to take aim. But he was too slow. Thomas was on him, the rifle swinging, and my brother collapsed in a heap for the second time in less than 12 hours. It was over. For real this time. Thomas stood over them, his chest heaving. Then he looked across the clearing, his eyes finding mine through the smoke. I stepped out of the trees, the pistol hanging limply at my side. We walked toward each other, meeting in the middle of the ruined clearing, a landscape of ash and death. He didn't say a word. He just pulled me into his arms, and I buried my face in his chest, the smell of smoke and gunpowder all around us. My ribs, I started to whisper, the old, familiar refrain. But I couldn't finish it. The words didn't fit anymore. They belonged to a different person, a different life. Your ribs will heal, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. But your spirit, Clara, your spirit is made of iron and fire. We stood there for a long time, holding each other, as the smoke from my diversionary fire drifted up to join the smoke from our burned-out home, the two columns twisting together and rising into the clean, bright morning sky. We had nothing left, no home, no safety, just each other, and a future we would have to build from the ashes. The ride to Cedar Falls was long and silent. Thomas had patched up Ben Morrison's leg, tied him securely to his horse, and slung a still unconscious Jeremiah over the saddle of the other. We left Caleb Jones's body where it lay, a grim offering to the wilderness. When we arrived, the town marshal, a weary-looking man with a drooping mustache, listened to our story with a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. The names Morrison and Jones clearly meant something to him. He locked our prisoners in his jail, took the deed from Thomas as evidence, and told us he'd have more questions in the morning. He gave us a voucher for 2 rooms at the town's only hotel. As I stood in the doorway of my room, a real room with 4 solid walls and a clean bed, I looked at Thomas. We were both covered in soot, our clothes were torn, and we were bone-tired, but we were alive, and we were free. Thank you, I said, the words feeling small and inadequate for what he had done. We saved each other, he replied, his gaze soft. Get some rest, Clara. But I couldn't rest. I washed the grime from my face and hands in the small basin and stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror. I saw a stranger, a woman with haunted eyes and a stubborn set to her jaw, a woman who had faced down her monster and won. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings. Our testimony, combined with the evidence on the deed and Ben Morrison's terrified confession, was enough to see Jeremiah and his associates sentenced to a long stretch in federal prison. The land, my land, was officially and legally mine alone. One sunny afternoon, after the trial was over, Thomas found me standing on the porch of the hotel, looking out at the dusty main street. What now? I asked, the question hanging in the air between us. My old life was gone. The new life we'd started to build was a pile of ashes. I was free, but I was adrift. Now, he said, stepping beside me, you get to decide. You can sell the land, take the money and go anywhere you want. East to a big city, west to the ocean. Start over, be anyone you want to be. The thought was dizzying. For so long, my world had been the size of a small cabin. Now the whole world was open to me. What about you? I asked, turning to face him. I'll be fine, he said, but he couldn't quite meet my eyes. I finished what I came here to do. Justice for Sarah. Maybe I'll move on too. Find somewhere new. My heart sank. I had imagined. I had hoped. Is that what you want? I asked, my voice small. To find somewhere new? He was quiet for a long moment. What I want, he said finally, his dark eyes meeting mine, is to build a new cabin with a porch big enough for 2 chairs. I want to plant a garden and fill the shelves with books. I want to spend my evenings reading to a woman with a spirit of iron and fire. Tears welled in my eyes, not tears of pain or fear, but tears of a joy so profound it ached. The position for the town school teacher is open, I said, a smile trembling on my lips. They need someone to start in the fall. A slow smile spread across his face. Is that so? And does this town have a good carpenter? Someone who knows how to build things to last? I think, I said, stepping closer to him, that's something we could build together. Spring came, painting the mountainsides with wildflowers. We used the money from selling a small corner of the land to the railroad to buy supplies. We built our new home on a rise overlooking the creek, not far from the ashes of the old one. It had big windows to let in the light and a porch that wrapped all the way around. One evening, we sat on that porch watching the sun set, our hands intertwined. Our new life was taking root, fragile but strong, like a seedling pushing its way through scorched earth. I thought about the phrase that had been my mantra for so long. My ribs are already broken. It had been a whisper of defeat, then a statement of endurance, then a cry of defiance. Now it was something else entirely. It was a scar, a reminder of a battle fought and won, a reminder that the deepest wounds can heal, and that sometimes things that are broken can be rebuilt into something even stronger. The pain was a part of my story, but it was no longer the whole story. The story was now about the quiet strength of a shared sunset. It was about the promise of a classroom full of children waiting to learn. It was about the steady, comforting weight of a good man's hand in mine. The story was about being whole. If you've ever felt broken, if you've ever had to fight your way out of the darkness, know this. Your scars are proof of your strength. You are not defined by what was done to you, but by the fact that you survived it. If you enjoyed Clara's story of survival and finding new beginnings, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. And let us know in the comments. What was the twist that shocked you the most?